Samuel J. Dubbin is a principal in the law firm of Dubbin and Kravitz. He is a former Clinton administration department official. He was the special assistant to Attorney General Janet Reno and a deputy assistant attorney general in the DOJ in the mid-90s. Sam's law firm was one of three that successfully represented Hungarian Holocaust survivors seeking restitution and an accounting against the U.S. government in the Hungarian gold train case, which settled for $25.5 million in 2005 after nearly 5 years of litigation. Sam's firm provides a variety of legal services to Holocaust survivors and the heirs of Holocaust victims, including advising Jewish families on the recovery of Nazi-looted art. He has testified before the U.S. House of Representatives Financial Services Committee, the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and U.S. Judiciary subcommittees on the right of Holocaust survivors to recovery of unpaid insurance policies. He assisted the Senate Select Committee on Aging and the House Committee on Foreign Affairs in organizing landmark congressional hearings on the healthcare needs of Holocaust survivors in the U.S. and around the world. Sam serves as counsel to the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA, which is a national coalition of grassroots survivor leaders representing 20 states. He has been honored by the Jewish Museum of Florida, the University of Miami Law School, and the Blue Card Foundation here in New York for his outstanding work on behalf of the survivor community. Sam joins us here in studio today, all the way from Florida. Sam, thank you so much for coming to speak to us about this very important topic. Clearly, you are qualified. You work directly with the survivor community. Could you tell us, in sum, what is the issue here with the claims conference?
The survivors' position, after years of dealing with the claims conference and the German government and attempting to get restitution of their looted assets and experiencing the hardships and tragedies of survivors aging and being in poverty, is that the existing system does not work and has not ever worked. Despite the fact that the claims conference has been in charge of Holocaust issues and Holocaust restitution since the end of the war, today in the year 2018, half of all Holocaust survivors in the United States and around the world live in or near poverty, and they do not come close to having the necessary care they need: home care, medical care, dental care, hearing aids, eyeglasses, wheelchairs, food, nutrition.
So you have a claims conference, which basically serves as the trustee, right, for funds that are given to it from Germany?
Basically, yes.
And they have, according to their 2016 990, at least $300 million right now in net assets. And yet you have Holocaust survivors around the world that are living at or near the poverty line. So the problem is they're not giving out the money.
That's one of the problems, and one of the problems that survivors have pointed out, for a couple of decades now, is that this claims conference maintained large reserves of funds for whatever future needs they, harbored while survivors were dying for lack of care. And that's a fact.
So they're making grants to other organizations.
So there are two basic sources of funding that the claims conference utilizes. Mm-hmm. The first source comes from Jewish properties in Eastern Europe that were not restituted after the war. Germany passed a law to allow those to be returned to the owners in 1990, and the claims conference made claims to thousands of those properties that the actual heirs and the actual survivors, missed the ridiculous 2-year deadline that Germany set. Mm-hmm. And when the claims conference made those applications, instead of holding it as a trustee for the actual heirs, the claims conference took the position years later that when an heir came forward, the actual heir, the actual survivor who owned the property, the claims conference said, no, we own that. We're not holding it as a trustee, it's ours.
So the German government gave properties to the claims conference to hold for people who had been robbed of their properties by the Nazis. And if they didn't come and report within 2 years, the claims conference said they lost the right to come. And then they took it as their own?
Yes. And there was a huge outcry from the survivors and the heirs periodically over the years. And so the claims conference would grudgingly say, okay, we're going to establish a goodwill fund, okay? Meaning we're going to give some of this money to some of these heirs. But over time, it was a very difficult process, and a small number of heirs were able to recover some of their funds. They started that in 1998. They did it again in 2003, 2004, but again, the process was very opaque and very difficult to navigate. So over time, what the Claims Conference was able to do was amass billions of dollars. Exactly how many, I can't say, but it's been at least $2 billion, maybe more, that it considers its money to dispense how it wishes.
But it's not its money. It's holding the money in trust for
the
Holocaust
actual
survivors and the heirs. Izzy Lieber of the Jerusalem Post wrote an article saying that by the time that they were allowing Holocaust survivors and their heirs to actually claim German property, that it was, quote, sold on the open market by the Claims Conference, and that in 2013, there was actually a court case in Germany, correct? And the court ruled against the Claims Conference position.
Correct.
Saying that they were wrong for the past 25 years, and that, in fact, it's not their property, it's the property of Holocaust survivors.
And yet they had amassed, billions of dollars, calling themselves the, quote, largest Jewish philanthropy in the world. Now, my view of philanthropy is it's either money you give out of your own pocket or money that you raise from others. It's not money that you acquire by a legal trickery, with the property of Holocaust victims. But that particular problem of the East German properties was reviewed by the British Board of Jewish Deputies.
Right.
And,
so it influenced a report, actually, that the Board of Deputies commissioned in the UK on the Claims Conference. And what did it show us?
Jeffrey Gruder, who's a barrister in England, did the independent report, and he said, quote, the Claims Conference refused to publish or disclose the details of heirless properties it recovered or claimed, both before and after the deadline set by Germany to claim the property in 1993. And that when pressured to provide information, it did so in a manner that made it virtually impossible for heirs to identify or claim their assets. Now, that was a report he did about in 2010. After that, there was another outcry by the heirs, and then the Claims Conference set up what they called the Late Applicants Fund, where, again, you had to waive your rights before you can even apply to it, and they would not promise, what level of property would be given back. But it allowed the Claims Conference to basically be the financial kings of the Jewish world, because they had a lot of money to give out. And one of the ways that they've amassed a tremendous amount of influence is by providing money to Jewish organizations worldwide, without regard to whether or not it was for the survivors.
If they're making grants to Holocaust museums and for Holocaust education, and they're giving money, I think the Anti-Defamation League is a recipient, what's wrong with that?
It's not their money, number one. Number two, as long as there are Holocaust survivors who are in desperate need of medicine, food, home care, dental care, the dental health of Holocaust survivors is terrible. With the malnutrition and the beatings and the starvation that they experienced in the camps, almost every survivor I know has tens of thousands of dollars of dental bills. Mm-hmm. Germany should be paying for that directly, but if the Claims Conference is going to be dispensing money, why in the world would they give the Anti-Defamation League money for education when a Holocaust survivor can't get their teeth fixed? Now, some of that money was used by the Claims Conference to provide for care, through the Jewish Family Services around the country.
But it's not enough. I went and I spoke to leaders in the Jewish community, professionals who work for these type of Jewish community organizations, and the answer was always the same. We don't have enough money. We apply for a grant, it could be $6 million. We only get 1/3 of that when we can prove the needs of Holocaust survivors. And on top of that, there's so many strings attached to the money that they can't use it to fund the types of basic needs that Holocaust survivors, need to live a dignified life. So the question is, the Claims Conference is a 501c3. I mentioned they do file a 990. Where is the board? Where is the board of directors on this? Where is the oversight? Where is the audit? Has any of this been done?
Well, in the mid-2000s, the audits of their assets were pulled back as being inaccurate by Ernst & Young did it, did the reports, and they were admitted to be improper.
Who admitted that?
Ernst & Young and the Claims Conference did, in a memo saying, we've got to revisit all of these issues. But to the satisfaction of the survivors, there's still never been a public accounting of how much money was recovered through the German properties and how it was all spent. and what's left, and what's left.
Well, we see from the 990 what they're claiming to be left, but every year they're on this press junket and they advertise, we negotiated this year X million dollars with the German government. Is there an accounting of exactly how that money is being spent? How much is for overhead? How much goes to administration? How it's being spent by the third-party organizations that they give it to? I mean, did they not amend their bylaws to allow them to make grants to organizations that don't have any direct involvement in providing survivor needs? Doesn't that defeat the whole purpose?
You're absolutely right, Brooke. That's after the German restitution law of 1990 was passed, setting the deadline for in 1992, and the claims conference set up a real estate company to make all these claims. It amended its bylaws in 1994, and instead of being limited to providing care and maintenance and assistance for victims of the Holocaust, it authorized spending money on research, education, and documentation. And that's always been the rationale for giving money to groups like B'nai B'rith, the World Jewish Congress, Anti-Defamation League.
But the thought that, the ADL or even the World Jewish Congress, organizations that I have, great amount of respect for, they don't have any problems fundraising. They're not short of money. And yet when you think of Holocaust survivors literally living at or below the poverty line today in New York, I think the stats are something like 40% of the Holocaust survivors in New York at or beneath the poverty line can't even afford food, can't afford glasses, can't afford their own medical care. What are they doing making these grants?
This is the reason that the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA formed itself among survivor leaders from around the country because of frustration over the lack of transparency, the lack of accountability, and the failure of the so-called restitution enterprise, up to that point, and the growing poverty and need among survivors that simply wasn't being met. To be a national advocate.
Talk about that. So your client is the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA.
That's correct.
Correct. And you wrote a letter, or the foundation wrote a letter to the Attorney General, asking the Attorney General of New York, of the state of New York, to look into what is going on. So we have Holocaust survivors who should be the recipients of this money, who the claims conference is holding money for as the trustee, appealing to the New York Attorney General's office saying, we're not getting the money, what is going on? And you submitted, or they submitted this letter, and what was the response?
Well, the letter was very detailed and covered a lot of the issues that have been causing damage to the survivor community, and it was precipitated, the proximate cause of the letter was the $57 million fraud that was perpetrated by claims conference employees working, colluding with other criminals, diverting money from funds earmarked by Germany for survivors. This was a fraud that took place over a 16-year period between the mid-90s and 2010 before it was discovered.
Well, tell me about this fraud. What exactly was happening? $57 million fraudulently stolen.
There was the insiders in the claims conference were working with runners and marks who were filling out fraudulent applications for pensions, and so they would lie about the year they were born. They would lie about the place they were born, and so for a $5,000 payment that was made, the insider in the claims conference would get $1,500. The runner would get $500. The person filling out the application would get several $100s. So they split the money. The fact that this went on without abatement inside an organization.
15 years.
And this is the organization that the Jewish community, as you say, has allowed to be the so-called sole representative of the survivor community. They get recognized by the German government, in Congress, everywhere you go. It's like the claims conference is taking care of the problems. Well, they were completely derelict in their responsibilities. And imagine, with the so-called billions of dollars that they've been negotiating here, they let this, that they allowed this kind of a fraud that, caused tremendous damage to, the needs of survivors. And so when then the ombudsman of the claims conference, did they even allowed their own insider to do the analysis of what went wrong.
Did they ever get the money back?
it would be very difficult to get the money back from some of these poor, people who were the ones getting it. But some of the money was restituted from the claims conference employees, but the damage was not, because the damage was.
So they're going to say, well,
Yes.
that's in the past. We're looking towards the future. That's actually what they did say when I called them. Say, well, we don't want to talk about it. That's in the past. What would you say to that?
Well, I would say what the Holocaust survivors are saying, which is that if you re-elect the same board of directors unanimously, if you keep the same management in place that allowed this fraud to be perpetrated under their noses for 16 years without noticing it, you shouldn't remain in control of an organization of this
So the board members remain the same. There has been no clearing of house, and almost every single, well, I don't know if it's every single, but a lot of the organizations whose representatives do serve on the board of the Claims Conference are also recipients of Claims Conference grants. So there is a potential conflict of interest there. Now, you organized hearings in Congress, and outspoken member of Congress, Ileana Ross-Lehtinen, came out in 2014 and did something very brave. She actually said that she has heard, and this is a quote, repeatedly concerns from some of my constituents regarding the failure, the deception, the lies of the Claims Conference, and how though this is intended to help survivors receive fair compensation, it has been an impediment in the process. Now, my understanding was her entire testimony, they tried to stop it.
Well, Congresswoman Ross-Lehtinen, along with Ted Deutsch, a representative from South Florida, and Congressman Rohrabacher and Engel, organized these hearings. It was done at the initiation of the Holocaust Survivors Foundation and their advocates to document the unmet needs of Holocaust survivors and their poverty status, and how are they doing? And it was extremely important. It was, the Senate had done one in January of that year, then the House did this in September 2014, and it was chilling documentation of the poverty among survivors, the lack of funding to take care of their basic needs. When you look at, for example, at the time the Claims Conference in Germany had announced that there was going to be $200 million in home care funding, for example, to cover 67,000 survivors. Well, if you do the math and you divide the $200 million by 67,000 survivors, that yielded a total of about $3,500 per survivor.
Per year.
Per year.
That's nothing.
And that covers
That's
10 weeks of home care. So here
Wow.
the Claims Conference in Germany were touting their great accomplishments, but if you picked up if you looked under the rock, you could tell that this was, deceptively, optimistic, when in fact it left people without a tremendous amount of care. So those are the kinds of revelations that came out of these hearings. And the Claims Conference tried to stop Ms. Ross-Lehtinen from having these hearings because they didn't want to have the fundamental problems.
How did they try to stop her? I have to say my experience is a lot of people are intimidated to speak about the Claims Conference because they do receive grants, even though they are lacking, and they don't want to jeopardize their grants. Obviously, the Claims Conference will advertise that they're the #1 largest Jewish philanthropy in the world, but that is essentially the problem. Their mission should not be to hand out money that isn't theirs to random organizations. And they you have reported, and it was mentioned in the letter that the Holocaust Survivors Foundation USA submitted to the Attorney General's office, that there is an element of intimidation of journalists, intimidation of Holocaust survivors, apparently, reportedly. Is that true?
Well, it is true. And I'll read you as an example of a testimony of Esther Finder. She's a second-generation leader. She was an official delegate of the United States government to the Prague Conference in 2009 and 2013 that was to deal with restitution, and eventually they were supposed to deal with the health care and poverty needs of survivors. And her report, she said, and it's worth me reading this if you don't mind, when I did my research on the needs of aging survivors, I contacted social service agencies all over the United States. Nobody had anything nice to say about the Claims Conference or its system of distributing funds, but they would not speak with me on the record. They expressed the same frustration. Though they are not getting sufficient funds from the Claims Conference to adequately care for the survivors, they would not speak publicly for fear of retribution. They did not want to lose that little bit of funding they were getting. They were intimidated and would only speak with me, quote, off the record.
It just is terribly depressing that having survived the Holocaust, coming to America, not being able to trust the entity that was set up to recover monies for you. And on top of it, if you speak out and you talk to journalists, or if you want to appear on a program about the issue, which we should all be talking about, this is a community issue, it's the health of our survivors, you feel intimidated to do so. I mean, this to me is an element of abuse on top of abuse.
I can tell you from firsthand experience, after the German court made that decision in 2013, holding that the claims conference indeed should be treated as a trustee and not as the owner of the property, I was interviewed by the Jewish Week. They did a story, documenting, quoting not just me but others who had experience in the field, and they were forced to take that article off of their website. You couldn't find it there today, although I can show you a copy of it. And I was told that they were, badgered by the claims conference to change that story, even though there wasn't one inaccuracy in the story.
Well, we're not going to be intimidated to talk about these issues openly because, number one, our responsibility is to the survivor community and to truth. And we are a little bit short on time, Sam. Thank you so much for coming to join us. But if you were to leave our audience with one thought, what can we do now going forward? So Izzy Lieber, for example, said that we should at least consider a temporary freezing of the projects that don't go towards helping survivors' needs directly. What do you suggest?
$18 million a year goes to non-survivor projects.
$18 million a year.
And that would pay for a lot of dental care, a lot of food, a lot of medicine that survivors, a lot of home care that survivors are not getting. But even that understates the problem dramatically, because if you look at the $480 million they now claim that they got for 2018 for home care, and you do the math there, that only pays for 25 weeks of home care a year. And that's after 10 years of what Stuart Eisenstadt calls very difficult negotiations. Mm-hmm. Well, the negotiations shouldn't be difficult, and Germany should not be able to hide behind the claims conference. And the claims conference should not act as a front for Germany.
Right.
And saying,
if Germany's not giving enough money, then don't advertise that this is a success.
The Congress, after those hearings we had in 2016, passed resolutions calling on Germany to pay for all of the survivors' needs, period. End of story. Have a direct system administered by the U.S. government similar to Medicare, where the survivors' needs are taken care of. There's no rationing. There's no picking and choosing among which community gets more money if you're a survivor.
Strings attached to the grants and so forth.
Stovepipes and funding, through different, avenues that people don't understand. Mm-hmm. Just have Germany pay the bill. So the Jewish community needs to speak out about the fact that their so-called leaders, not only the organizations who are part of the claims conference and the Jewish federations and the family services who are getting that money, they need to speak out and say, it's time for Germany to just pay these bills and let us do our job as medical professionals, helping survivors. Let Germany pay for it. Let's get the organizations and the middlemen out of the picture.
Absolutely. Sam, thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate it.